Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our panel on speech rights, learning communities, and academic freedom. I'm Catherine Rowe, Provost and Dean of the Faculty. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what inspired this panel, what our hopes are for it, and a little bit about the moderator's role, and invite you to tweet on our hashtag Campus Discourse. Also, you can turn down the ringers on your phones if you want, so we can not be recording them while we record the other parts of the panel. This panel comes out of the work this year of the Campus Discourse Working Group, a group of staff, students, faculty, alumni, and administrators who have been exploring two questions that many campuses are grappling with right now. One is, what are our rights and responsibilities as speakers in an open and diverse campus community? And the second question is, what are our aspirations for ourselves as listeners? If there's an overall message this panel wants to convey, it's that we aspire that everything be open to question at Smith, and that we be grappling with our disagreements in a thoughtful and sustained way. The working group has become deeply curious about why these questions are urgent ones now on college campuses. We suspect that they are broadly relevant in professional workplaces, in other communities around the nation and around the world. And we see grappling with them as part of what it means to be an educated citizen in a networked world. So we're especially happy to have you here with us tonight, thinking together. I'm going to start with introductions. Our panelists are Carrie Baker, Professor of the Study of Women and Gender; Ambreen Hai, Professor of English Language and Literature; Mark Lendler, Professor of Government; Marilyn Schuster, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Humanities in the Study of Women and Gender; and Dwight Hamilton, Chief Diversity Officer. Welcome. So we are wearing multiple hats here. Many of us wear the hats of teachers, of scholars. Some of us wear the hats of administrators. Two of us have degrees in law, and we'll be putting on and taking off those different hats as we grapple with a series of questions that we've brought together for us to be thinking about with you today. We brainstormed 4 phases to this conversation. The first is, what's the legal context for thinking about speech rights in the US? And what other contexts are there besides legal ones? The second is, what's the relationship between speech rights and academic freedom? Because this is a learning community that's structured around ideas of academic freedom. The third is that we're going to invite ourselves to model some counterintuitive thinking for you, and then to have you join us in it in the 4th phase of the conversation, Q&A from the audience. We also have some questions that have come in over email, and we will be following our hashtag, Campus Discourse, to see if any other questions come through there. I have an ask for you as the audience, which is to help us represent the nuance and the complexity of our discussions on Twitter. One of the things that we are all learning to do in an age of social media is carry context forward in formats that aren't necessarily rich in context or rich in nuance. But when we do that work together, I think we can capture nuance as a group. So that's what I'm going to be asking for you, those of you who are tweeting. As a moderator, my role is going to be to pose questions that the panelists have generated together, questions that have been raised to us by students and staff and faculty and alumni. I'm going to be watching the clock to make sure everyone has an opportunity to weigh in and that we have ample time for Q&A towards the end of an hour. And I will not be editorializing. I will not be summing up for Smith or my own position, although I wear many of these hats as well and care deeply about the issues. I'm looking to create space of conversation here for everyone else. So let's start with the legal context. What speech is protected by the Constitution in the US? And Mark, you teach a whole course on this topic, so we've left the opening words to you.
Okay, well, first of all, I think we'd all like to thank Catherine for pulling this together and pushing it through to its conclusion. As I'm sure many of you know, Smith, being a private school, is not bound by the limits of the First Amendment, which doesn't mean it can't be if it chooses. And my perspective now and throughout this panel will be that it should honor speech rights in the same way the First Amendment does, or at least as has been interpreted by the courts. Now, what is that? if there's one principle that I think defines the court's stance that has evolved over the last 100 years, it's called content neutrality, meaning that speech can be regulated on the basis of time, place, and manner, but not on the basis of its viewpoint. So, for instance, a town can regulate a demonstration based on not wanting to interfere with traffic or not wanting citizens to be disturbed at 3 in the morning, but it cannot place a regulation, say, on a pro-Israeli demonstration that it couldn't on a pro-Palestinian demonstration. That is content discrimination. Now, what are some exceptions to the protection of speech that have been organized by the courts? I'm going to be very brief on this. Libel, true threats, meaning specific threats of a believable character against specified individuals. Harassment, measured by objective criteria like how tangible, how pervasive, and how invasive. And the most important one in the famous Brandenburg case, direct incitement to immediate lawless action in a situation in which that is likely. I can elaborate on that at some other point if you want me to. The last thing I want to say is, what are some exceptions that people think exist that don't exist? One is fighting words. There is a very, very narrow of fighting words doctrine which still exists, which is a face-to-face situation in which somebody says something that is likely to cause a fight. There has been no fighting words conviction upheld by the Supreme Court since the original 1945 ruling in the creation of the fighting words doctrine. There is no civility exception to the First Amendment. That is, there's no First Amendment 1A which says all that stuff about the speech, about expression and press, that's only if you speak reasonably. There is no obligation for reasonableness. And last, and most important, in terms of the discussion we're having, there is no legal doctrine called hate speech. It isn't as though the court has never considered it. It has considered it and rejected it. And however you might feel about it, and you might disagree with those rulings, but the fact is there is no such constitutional and legal doctrine known as hate speech.
In the U.S.
In the United States,
That's right.
Which is where we are.
And anything we'd want to add to that?
Well, sure. From my perspective, there sometimes is there can be a conflict. The institution I come from was a public institution, so we were subjected to the First Amendment and its protections of freedom, and that caused some very difficult interactions sometimes where we had to tolerate certain expressions that were in opposition to the values of our institution. There was a particular group every Friday before Labor Day. They were not the Westboro Baptist Church, but somewhat similar to that group. And they would take a prominent place in public sphere on the campus and tell our students in no uncertain terms why they were going to hell for a variety of sins, real and imagined. So we would get reports. You're saying that this is an open environment. Why are you allowing these hateful, intolerant people on our campus? And, it wasn't an answer that we can give that satisfied the community, but again, we had to be content neutral, and that we couldn't forbid this one group because we didn't like what it is that they said. We had to really accept groups in that public sphere. Now, yes, this is a private institution, and we don't have those same legal or constitutional restrictions here. But at the same time, I think that if part of our mission is to create students who are critical thinkers or to help them become critical thinkers in order for them to be more effective leaders in your lives, I think that we do have a responsibility to have unpopular views protected at this institution.
Okay, in the interest of pushing back a little bit, I'm very pro First Amendment. I think it's a good thing, and I think a very robust First Amendment is a good thing. I do think that a private educational institution has a distinct mission and values, and at heart, a productive learning environment is important. And to have a productive learning environment, it has to be respectful. And I don't see a lot of respectful, productive conversations coming from the Westboro Baptist Church. Now, their views are valuable to know about, but their manner, their uncivil manner, I think is not helpful. It doesn't help produce productive conversations. And so while I'm open to the possibility of taking a very fundamentalist First Amendment approach and thinking about it for us here at Smith, my concern is that, we have young people who are in a formative stage, and we as faculty, the state has a very different relationship to the citizens than the administration and faculty do to the students, right? I mean, we have an obligation to guide and teach students how to interact productively once they get out into the world. And so and again, I don't know how far I'd go. My background is I do research on sexual harassment, and I have seen in my research how destructive sexual harassment can be to a productive learning environment. And so I think that I would be, definitely wanting to have an environment where sexual harassment wasn't allowed.
Just to get the conversation even more complex, are there other ways to think about speech protections or challenges to speech rights besides constitutional and legal ones that we'd want to have in play in a learning community like this? Yeah.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay. So I wanted to give this a little bit of an international comparative framework so that in addition to thinking about the US context, which is of course where we are also in the world. So a couple of things I wanted to say first off. First of all is that, of course, freedom of speech is an incredibly precious right. It's a human right, actually, as defined by the United Nations. And I'm just going to read you very quickly from 1948. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 19 from 1948, which says, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers," unquote. Okay, so that's the United Nations. Of course, that doesn't mean that every country, even if it agrees with that or has assented to that, necessarily has that in their constitution. So point one was that it's a universal human right. Point two is that there are always limits on freedom of speech, even constitutionally in other countries. And those limits vary depending on the history of the country and its particular values or whatever has happened in that case. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. In addition to of course, the U.S., which has its limits, and thank you, Mark, for sharing. I would add, perhaps, I think, even to the U.S., child pornography, defamation, as you talked about, false advertising, I think trade secrets, these are all national security secrets, gag orders, these are all part of the United States limitations on free speech. So the First Amendment does allow us to at least, okay, two things. The First Amendment covers what the government can restrict, not what private parties can restrict on each other's free speech. That's an important thing to keep in mind. That's in the US. Outside the US, other limitations, which can be very restrictive and repressive, in fact. So if you think about Africa and Asia, there are a number of blasphemy laws, and those have been used against individuals to the extent of violence. In many countries, there are blasphemy laws against any religion. In specific countries, there are blasphemy laws against specifically Islam. For example, in Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia is against any religion. Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia against Islam. So if you are accused, or if you are, and this can be really problematic because you can imagine that, for example, in Pakistan, where I grew up, if someone is accused of blasphemy, anyone can be accused of blasphemy for the slightest criticism, and that can be really very problematic. Elsewhere, South Africa, because of the history of apartheid, hate speech or incitement to cause harm is prohibited, and even though South Africa has among the most liberal free speech laws in Africa. And in Europe, again, because of the history of anti-Semitism and, of course, the Holocaust, there are various restrictions, specifically on Holocaust denial, okay, and on hate speech. And I'm just going to quote very quickly what Denmark says in their freedom of speech, which is granted in all cases, except, for example, hate speech is illegal according to the Danish Penal Code, and I quote, "Any person who publicly or with the intention of disseminating makes a statement threatening, insulting, or degrading a group of persons on account of their race, national or ethnic origin or belief shall be liable to a fine or to simple detention or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years." That's Denmark, and different countries have different versions of this, including South Africa. I mean, that's not Europe, but yeah. So my point here is that A, recognizing the universal human right, B, that there are always limits, and the limits have to do with what the philosopher Nigel Warburton calls, quote, competing values, that there are always competing values. The priority on the one hand of freedom of speech, of individual liberty, and those are very important things, because it means that in any democratic society, some have argued, to have a democratic society, you need to have freedom of speech, because then you can have dissenting opinions. We learn from each other, from disagreement. A minority, John Stuart Mill was particularly concerned about minorities being suppressed or minority opinions being suppressed. If you have even one person who has a different opinion, you might learn from that, and so it's important to hear that. So in a democracy, the advancement of public good, it's a social good, it's not an individual good, but it's a social good to have freedom of speech. Okay, but that also comes up against, in conflict with what are called competing values, and competing values can be protection of child abuse, hence child pornography is restricted, right? Even in the U.S. Or other kinds of competing values, such as harms caused by hate speech, which can incite violence or anger or prejudice against particular groups by virtue of their race or religion, etc. So, in other words, one conclusion from this is that the United States is the only advanced democracy where hate speech is not illegal.
So let me ask, in the context of this span of ideas about speech protections and challenges to speech rights around the world, what are our obligations as an educational institution?
Well, first of all, I also want to thank you, Catherine, for putting this together. And to begin by saying that I think that maybe our primary obligation as an educational institution is to foster debate, diversity, the expression of diversity of views, and especially dissent, to learn how to craft a position, how to come to a position on important issues and argue for it. Also to understand what the underlying arguments are for a position that you don't take, to really understand what that's all about. Now, there are certain dangers inherent in really having difficult conversations, which I think we should have. One is that sometimes ideas become associated with identity. If someone expresses an idea that's very controversial, that has high stakes, that people have high feelings about, sometimes the reaction is to say, oh, that person is A, and that person is a person who holds this view. We should be able to change our ideas. We should be able to grow with ideas, to really understand from each other what it means to grow intellectually, and not to be boxed into a position taken at a certain time. I think we also, as an institution, need to recognize and bring to the fore what power differentials do to debate. A teacher is in a different position of power from a student. An administrator is in a different position of power than other staff members, than faculty, and so forth. To recognize those power differentials and try to smooth them out in some way, to be certain that all voices are heard. And I think we should also recognize right from the beginning that discomfort is part of the process. I seem to be alliterative here with dissent and discomfort and so forth, but that it's not easy to engage in debate about issues about which we feel very strongly. And I'll say that a lot of my view of this comes out of the work that I do, which is in part about the dangers of censorship. And censorship can take many forms. State censorship is perhaps clearest. But there can be censorship in the way that ideas are reacted to, in the ways that ideas are expressed. And I think we should all be aware of that. And when we're talking about the law, who is it who is going to be enforcing? What is the authority to enforce various kinds of restrictions on free expression? That's the beginning.
Anybody want to loop back to anything in this conversation so far?
If I may, making a statement about, protecting the rights of people to express unpopular opinions, there's no requirement for an institution itself to be neutral in its own assertion of its values or its mission. I think a most recent example of that was the president of the University of Oklahoma with the incident regarding the fraternity, and the president stated the University of Oklahoma's values in no uncertain terms. We could have a side issue on whether he was on legally solid ground as far as some of the actions that he took, but he certainly did state what the university's mission was. So there's no requirement, even when you're protecting the rights of others to express, to not articulate what your mission or your values are.
So thinking about that, since one of our core mission commitments is academic freedom, I thought I would bring that into the conversation and ask you to reflect as a group on the relationship between speech rights and academic freedom. So let's start with the basic question: what is academic freedom and who has it? Mark, do you want to fill us in on that?
Well, this is less well defined than, because courts have been handling the issue of speech rights and given clear definition to it. This is less well defined, but in general, the notion of academic freedom is the idea of free speech translated to a college campus. And I'll just read you what the American Association of University Professors says, 2 lines of it. Freedom of thought and expression is essential to any institution of higher learning. On a campus that is free and open, no ideas can be banned or forbidden. No viewpoint or message may be deemed so hateful or disturbing that it may not be expressed. Now, one thing I want to point out is that in the various ways in which Smith's own codes address this issue of protected or unprotected speech, there is the strongest protection given to what people say in the classroom, virtually ironclad protection, and I think that's all to the good. But the AAUP also says this mission that they just described guides learning outside the classroom quite as much as in class, based on, I think, the obvious fact that the totality of a student's and faculty's learning environment is the whole of the community in which we live. And I will also add that the courts have actually, in spite of the fact that academic freedom is less definable than the First Amendment itself, courts have actually extended the protection or protections to academic freedom, particularly in the 1950s, when it was necessary to shield some teachers from inquisition from the state. And courts had a couple of cases in which they said it's important to protect learning in the classroom and on college campuses from the pall of orthodoxy. And my only addition would be that pall of orthodoxy, or orthodoxy itself, is a problem no matter where it is generated from.
Were you going to add something? So
I
you're
was
nodding.
just agreeing.
One thing we know from, and we hear a lot of from Smith alumni, is how much they value their ability to communicate across diverse audiences in writing, in conversation, in a sophisticated way, and that the ability to disagree productively is a really crucial part of that sophistication. So I'm curious what you see as a group are the community practices that can help us foster productive disagreement, particularly around deeply held concerns and very divergent ideas.
Okay, well, I'll address that. I think to bring together something Marilyn said with something Mark said, I think that power is really important to pay attention to power and people's ability to express their opinions. Because I think sometimes if somebody's outnumbered or they feel like they have an unpopular opinion, they might be hesitant to express it. And so I think that faculty in particular need to really work on paying attention to power dynamics, not only between students, but between themselves and students. And the key, I think, has to be respect. Respecting people to be able to say their opinions, even if you disagree with them. And so just so I felt very discouraged last spring when the whole thing happened around the commencement speaker, because I felt like there was a lot of discussion on campus where faculty in particular were disrespectful of students and the kinds of things that they said, in the characterizations of students. I think this happened in a faculty listserv discussion. I think it happened even at faculty meetings where students were referred to as not acting in good taste, as being too proud, of lacking grace, of being lazy and bold, and encouraging a breach of decorum. And what concerns me about this language, there was some pushback to this. In response to this language, another faculty member said, "Are we teaching students to be proper good girls here at Smith, or women who think critically without submitting to those in power?" So I think we need to think about gender when we're thinking about classroom dynamics and people's ability to express themselves, because and we know this, right? Communication is very gendered. And I think we as an institution, as a women's college, and as a college that wants to be producing these leaders, need to think hard about the ways in which gender restricts speech or perhaps facilitates particular kinds of speech but not other kinds of speech. And so that's one point. And then another point is I think we as faculty members have to respect our students, but also have to learn about who our students are. I think that there's been a lot of change in who the student body is over the last 20, 30 years. It's much more international. It's a much wider array of folks along like neural diversity, around racial diversity, class diversity, and I think all of these things impact people's ability to express themselves. Their comfort level in disagreeing with people they may perceive as more powerful than them, whether that's a faculty member or somebody of a dominant race or a dominant class. And faculty need to come up with very specific strategies on how to try to even that playing field so that everybody can participate. And that creates this productive learning environment that I talked about before as being a major goal of educational institutions.
Other thoughts about what helps us disagree productively?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ambry. I was just going to add one little thing that I forgot to read before. It says, in an academic community, the remedy for ideas believed to be distasteful or offensive should be confrontation with other ideas and superior evidence, not administrative sanction. That's from the Smith College Civil Rights Policy and Grievance Procedures. Unfortunately, is no longer part of Smith's codes in relation to expression.
Umbreen.
I just wanted to second and agree with what Carrie said. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to go back to since there was so much debate around the Christine Lagarde withdrawal last year, I just wanted to say a couple of things. Some of the alumni contributed to this too. It wasn't just faculty who were, I think, quite disrespectful to our students as well. In that, in the Alumni Quarterly, there were some letters published by alums that, and I'm going to quote, accused students of, quote, bigotry, rigid thinking, knee-jerk refusal to listen to opposing views, silencing, endangering free speech, and narrowing diversity of thought. And I would say that this was an unfair dismissal of legitimate concerns raised by the students. And a couple of things. One is that people very quickly forgot that Christine Lagarde chose to withdraw, that she was not silenced. Again, the question of power comes into play. She has plenty of power and access to free speech in that what she says gets recorded, disseminated. What our students have a right to protest. And that right to protest was exercised by some students. If Christine Lagarde chose to withdraw, that was unfortunate because it meant that she did not come to campus and engage in the debate that could have happened on campus. Other speakers have done that, and other campus commencement speakers have certainly done that.
Can I introduce a phrase that we had been talking about, which is the phrase counter speech? I thought I heard that in Mark's. Could you define counter speech for us? Umbreen?
Or-
Yeah. Or either of you, yes.
Well, counter speech is responding to any kind of what you find problematic argument, right? Or with fighting speech with speech. Counter speech is the concept used as an alternative to silencing. So in other words, I was reading this piece about how at Oxford some students invited a Holocaust denier to speak and gave that person a platform, and rather than silence that person, the argument made was that the best way to fight bad speech is with good speech. That's counter speech. So that instead of silencing or censoring, you allow the bad ideas to be aired so that you can argue against them. But it is a question of argument, so that's counter speech.
Right. Were you going to add something, Mark?
Well, yeah, the phrase actually comes from a famous Supreme Court justice. Early in the century, around the time of World War I, the United States government was throwing people in jail for very mild opposition to the war, of a kind that you see around every war all the time now, and for long jail terms. Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis started a counter trend to that, and one of the things that Louis Brandeis said was that the response to speech that you disapprove of is more speech, not enforced silence. That term enforced is very important. Counter speech as opposed to some authority enforcing silence.
And I think, just to add to that, if you suppress speech, if you repress the opportunity to express even very distasteful opinions, it's not that those opinions or those positions will go away. They will go underground, and they'll come back to haunt us even more. So I think that what you're saying about the need for us to encourage counter speech, to encourage argument, how to make an effective argument is really part of what our mission is.
But I think we need to do that without shaming people. We need to actually address their arguments and not their character, or, to say they're lazy or they're, whatever. We need to focus on their arguments, which I feel like in the commencement context, people weren't having discussions about the arguments. People were having discussion about the character of the students.
In fact, if I may sort of one more thing, which is that sometimes the term freedom of speech can be used itself to silence others, and that became what happened. That is sort of what happened with the Christine Lagarde affair, in that students were scolded publicly for protesting, and they were accused of denying Christine Lagarde freedom of speech, but in fact, it was the students whose freedom of speech was actually put in question.
I think one thing that I have discovered in just 8 months or so in the Smith community is how much we value our long tradition of activism and dissent here, how much we cherish that, and how much the alumni cherish that as well. Let me turn the conversation to something that we felt was really going to be fun as well as important in this conversation, which is to model some counterintuitive thinking, to play with the ideas that seem backward or surprising or not logical in this territory. So we wanted to talk about some of the significant negatives that we grapple with when we are disagreeing, discomfort that's generated when we disagree deeply, and how we deal with offensiveness. So I wanted to start with the first of our contrarian questions, which is, when is discomfort valuable? When is it productive?
Why do I want to jump into discomfort? I think that discomfort is often the sign that education is happening. If we come to college, or if we come to a classroom expecting expecting that our beliefs, that our thoughts about various issues will be reinforced, then we're not open to changing our minds or to learning more about whatever the issue is. And you've used the word productive, I think, to notice that discomfort, to recognize it, to bring it into the discussion and say, where does that come from? Why do I feel that discomfort, and make that part of the conversation. I'd also just like to elaborate a little bit. We've all talked about the need for counterspeech, for argumentation, and there are certain forms of argument that I think are not productive. Eye rolling is one of them. The assumption that there is a shared basic position that if you're really smart, you will have that position, is not really about argument. And name calling is certainly not effective as a form of argument. So I think our job as teachers and in the classroom is to teach some of those techniques about learning how to form a position and to argue it effectively.
I spent the first 15 years of my quote-unquote grown-up years as a litigator. And I know there's a perception that in litigation, because it's an adversarial court system, that you're really just, fighting against the other side. But what most people don't realize is that the art in litigation is that of persuasion, because you're not really trying to necessarily defeat, although there is that adversarial element, your opponent. You're trying to persuade the finder of fact, whether that's a jury or a judge. So I think that persuasion is somewhat of a lost art. We've gotten really good at throwing words back and forth at one another. Social media, we haven't really talked about social media. And I think we're still wrestling with the ramifications for this new form of communication, both in the effects of anonymity in communications, and also I think that the screen of a computer is also a psychological screen between yourself and the person who receives that communication. And you hit that send button, and it's almost worse because now you're frozen. You're frozen in your journey. You may not even, it could be in the heat of the moment. It could just be where you are in that particular point in your life, and you may not end up being that person. But now you have committed yourself. You are frozen in time, and you can possibly be represented by that statement that you made, that you may not have made if you were sitting across the table from the person that you were having a discussion with.
I learned just last week about software that's being developed to keep you from hitting that send button, whether it's email or even more so texting, which is really in the moment. And so it's an effort to keep you from yourself as you're responding in that heat of the moment.
One thing I would say also, I've sometimes heard students say about other students that they're in a particular classroom, for example, that some students take over and talk more, and that it's hard to get a different kind of position or opinion in there. And when I hear that as a teacher, my response is to say, you take responsibility of your education. You can always jump in yourself. You can always say, can we talk about this differently, or can we? So there's a certain degree of responsibility that we have to take ourselves in disrupting a conversation, whether there seems to be a consensus, whether there seems to be a majority position, whatever that might be. So I think it's not sufficient to say, oh, there's a certain way in which people talk, and I can't get in there, because you can.
In other words, see that as a moment of opportunity. Carrie, I saw
I
you
also
leaning
think
forward,
we
yeah.
as educators can do things to try to facilitate a broader array of discussion. I mean, in my classes, I try to provide multiple forums for students to express themselves. Obviously, large class discussion, but some people aren't comfortable there and are not ready for that yet. So they're small groups, they can get warmed up there. It may even end up being in Moodle posts or other kinds of, but by providing an array of different ways of expressing yourself, then we can build towards being able to stand up in front of a group and say something, which at first somebody might be hesitant to do. And then I think we as an institution can do the same thing, provide a variety of forums and ways to get a full and fair hearing of disagreements, but with attention to power, again.
So are there other thoughts on when discomfort can be valuable, when we should be seeking it or fostering it or protecting it or cherishing it? I'm trying to bring the verbs that are the counterintuitive verbs that go with it together.
Well, let me offer a counterintuitive thought that is not mine. It actually comes from James Madison. And that is that strong and widespread agreement on a fundamental set of ideas leads to intolerance or provides a basis for intolerance. The reason is when people in a given community are largely in agreement around a set of social, political ideas, arguments, ideas, images from outside that consensus look evil or even criminal. And therefore, and Madison was proposing something quite new. He said you have to be on the lookout for intolerance most in like-minded communities. Now, is Smith a like-minded community? I know it almost doesn't, there's no point in saying this, but I will. Based on the last survey that was done, 84% of Smith students lean Democratic, 4% lean Republican. 71% declared themselves either liberal or very liberal, 3% conservative or very conservative. In 2008, 90% of the students said they were going to be supporting Barack Obama, 3% John McCain. Now, that's just telling you what you already know. But the point of that is that when there is this kind of fundamental disagreement, that is the place to be on the lookout for a tendency, and a tendency on the part of that comes from human nature to enforce that by looking at outlying views from the outside, dissenting views, as being something that are unacceptable. And I'll add one last point. I'm sure a lot of you read the article by Judith Shulevitz in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, and the point that she was making, not about Smith but broadly, is that if students are not exposed to anything but the views that they already agree with in school, they'll be surprised and unable to deal with views and people that they don't agree with when they leave. Well, I think it's worse than that. I think that unfortunately we've arrived at a point where people can live large parts of their lives and their times only getting information that they agree with from the news sources that they agree with and online communities that they already agree with. And I don't think that's a benefit. I don't think it's a benefit to us here. I don't think it's a benefit to individuals or to the country as a whole.
I suspect, and I don't know if the archives have the data that would support this, but I'll say it anyway. I suspect that if you had done a similar poll in 1952, 1954, it would have been the reverse. How does that happen? Institutions change, students change. The institution is not isolated from the larger community, from the nation and from and global context. And it would be instructive to sort of figure out how that happened. But I couldn't agree with you more about the tendency, particularly with news sources. It's much easier to get your news only from sources that you feel comfortable with. And how many people seek out news sources that represent a different position altogether from the one that they're comfortable with. And one of the ways that we as teachers can experiment with that is to assign positions to students to argue from in class. So, and since it's an assignment, you can't say, well, that person is someone who believes X. That person is simply doing the assignment. But it's useful because you learn how a position that differs from your own is supported and can be argued.
So I think that's, even though I promise not to say anything on my own behalf, that's my cue to quote Milton. Many of you know I'm a Milton scholar, a Renaissance scholar, and Milton's one of my favorite writers. And one of the enduring phrases from Areopagitica, one of the early essays against too much licensing and censorship in printing, is the idea that that which purifies us is trial, and trial is by that which is contrary. So that the work of working through a contrary position makes your ideas better, stronger, richer, suppler, strengthens them. So incredibly necessary for a community and for a mind. Carrie, you look like you were going to say something.
Well, can I just, I agree with what you're saying, Mark, and it's very interesting to think about 1952 as opposed to right now in terms of political affiliations, perhaps. But how someone chooses to vote, whether Democrat or Republican in this country, as if there were, since there aren't too many other choices, doesn't necessarily mean that there's homogeneity of opinion on other matters. So in other words, you could be, say, a Democrat or a Republican on certain, and even within that, one might say you may agree with Democrats on an economic issue, but Republicans on a different issue. That's entirely possible. So I want to complicate this binary of Democrat, Republican, and also that's one thing. And the second thing is that there may be a whole heterogeneity of opinions that's separate from one's political commitments, not political, one's how one votes in terms of which political party. There are other kinds of political commitments that can be heterogeneous.
Let me put our second contrarian question into the mix, which is, can disagreement be pleasurable?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. And I know I spent most of my career as a litigator, so maybe I'm not the sample population. But even before then, in undergrad, my fondest memories are being in a student lounge talking about an issue with people who didn't agree with me till 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And I miss that. I miss having that opportunity. And that's one of the reasons why I really am protective of people's abilities to express unpopular opinions, because if I didn't have that experience, I think I would have been a profoundly different person. Now, I didn't always have the opportunity to litigate things that I necessarily agreed. Part of the reason why I'm no longer practicing law. There was an intellectual challenge to it, but I didn't find it personally fulfilling. Where I do now. But I like to test the boundaries. I like to test my own thoughts. And sometimes the only way that I can do that is to come across someone who is respectful, who is coming at it from also an intellectual point of view. I think that those areas, to me, I find that incredibly rewarding.
Anyone else on
Well,
the pleasures of disagreement?
I can say this, pleasurable, I'm not sure. Productive, necessary, useful, yes. Maybe the most useful are the ones that are not the most pleasurable. And let me give an example that I'll bet Marilyn will remember firsthand.
Talk about discomfort.
Well, you'll see it puts us in the same age range.
Oh, okay.
And that is in the first appearances of the women's movement in the mid and late 1960s. Let me put it this way. The discourse that took place was not civil. Among the organizations expressing their views were groups like the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell and the Society for Cutting Up Men, to whose author that was not really a metaphor. And I can tell you...
It was all about the acronym. It was all about the acronyms,
right.
Witch and
Witch
scum.
and scum, right.
Okay.
Right. And this was the first appearance, not the very first appearance, but the most dramatic appearance of an oppositional train of thought that most people didn't want to hear. And frankly, even though I was a student radical, I didn't want to hear it, but I needed to. And it was wild, it was extreme, but it was very useful. Sometimes people have to shout to be heard, particularly when a marginal idea is asking to be heard. That doesn't mean that all shouters are right, but it does mean that at times, if you are bothered by, if you are discomforted by someone who is trying to impress something on you, even if they say it in an extreme way, it can be very useful and it can transform your life.
All right, I'm going to do our third counterintuitive question, which is, I think, the hardest of the lot. Can offensiveness be valuable and productive?
Well, I think the example Mark just gave shows that it can be over the long term.
Say more.
Offensive demonstrations and even positions that are taken publicly, extreme positions in order to move thinking forward. I'd like to change that language a little bit and say, are there cases where provocation can be useful and productive? And I think it can be. Offensiveness and it may be that respect is lost in a context of offensiveness, but provocation can, strangely, be respectful. You can be respectful of the person and be provoking them to rethink something or to engage with you about an issue that you and the other person ideally find really important.
I have to say, I don't like the term offensive or of taking offense because it's so subjective. Anybody can say they're offended by anything. And how do you decide that that's a reasonable claim? So, for example, in Britain, if Hindus say that they're offended by Muslims and Muslims say they're offended by Hindus, what are you going to do? And religion becomes a real problem. Or at least claims to offensiveness around religious issues are very difficult to adjudicate. I would back to our academic sort of environment, learning environment, or elsewhere, it seems to me that many scholars and others are talking about not making claims in terms of offensiveness, but rather in terms of injury, harm. Those might be more persuasive. Again, back to persuasion. Right? And actually, back to academic environments, I want to go back to what Carrie said earlier with regard to sexual harassment. I think that one of the issues for an academic community or educational institutions is that there are different, again, competing claims. On the one hand, the importance of freedom of speech for the sake of, as an educational goal, as we've been talking about. On the other hand, there is a competing claim, which is that of providing a level playing field. An environment that fosters learning as opposed to a hostile environment. And sometimes those different claims can come into conflict with each other. Title IX is one issue, right? So sexual harassment, racist, again, these are values of different institutions, but values to have no discrimination on the basis of race, class, gender, etc. So how do we assure both? How do we assure at once freedom of speech, which might include offensiveness, or perhaps injury, right? Especially when it comes to historical harms or histories of not just hurt, but actually injury. That is, and this goes back to, actually I'm thinking now of Wendy Kaminer, another big issue that happened for our campus last year. When Wendy Kaminer said, not only, when she used the slur word, and then she said, nothing happened. And then the N-word, and she used the actual word, which we refer to as the N-word, and then said nothing happened. That's a misunderstanding of what language does. And do I have 2 minutes?
Well, can we just, I know somebody was going to also answer the question about, the counterintuitive question about offensiveness, so can we come back to that?
Yeah.
Just hold the thought.
I can.
Yeah.
I will. As someone who has looked at the issue of harassment and discrimination in all of my career, when I hear offensiveness, the problem is subjectivity. I don't know what that means. I can tell you what the definition of harassment is. I can tell you what the definition of hostile environment, quid pro quo. I can tell you the definitions and the burden of proof you have for discrimination. Offensiveness is slippery. I don't know necessarily what that means. I do think there can be a value in it. And for whatever reason, I don't know why the producers keeps coming up in my mind, right? The play. Now, I'm curious, right now I think, it became a popular Broadway play after being a successful movie. I don't know, actually, a cult movie maybe. I don't know how successful it was, but I would be curious to know if that was created anew today, whether it would be shut down. But I don't think that the movie and then the play it came from were designed intentionally to be offensive, although having a play that talks about a musical comedy based on the Holocaust is inherently offensive. I don't think the purpose of the larger work was to be offensive. And I think the environment that we're in now is that people are see offensiveness as a virtue. And I just don't see that as the case. I think it's kind of an intellectual form of pornography or obscenity where there is no artistic value to it, but it's seen as a virtue. I have a saying that, and I'll censor myself, but the Constitution protects your right to be a expletive that starts with A, but it doesn't require you to be one. But I think that people now are looking, when you're seeing a backlash in some forms of expression as being offensive, people are almost, they're trying to protect the offensiveness for its own sake. And that is concerning to me. But I don't want to restrict it either because, maybe in the wrong hands, and that could be 99% of the population, it serves no value. But in the hands of Mel Brooks, for example, that 1%, there is a credible work of art that came from it.
I'm watching the time here, and I'm wanting to make sure that we take some questions from the audience. Okay, to start with that now. We did have one question that came in over email, so I thought I'd start with that while the rest of you collect your thoughts about what you'd like to ask. We do have somebody with a mic, is that right? Ready to... Yes, right there. There is a mic right there. So, Justin, you willing to walk that around? Just, if we could start by seeing, are there hands up for people who would like to ask a question? Okay, great. So at least 4 or 5. I'm going to start with a question that we got in over email, but then keep your hand up so Justin can see, and maybe start at the back of the room and work our way down. Yeah. Okay. So this is for all the panelists here. Would bullying a person based on an unpopular conservative opinion also be considered hate speech? Or is hate speech only ever related to race category? And I'm assuming gender, race, other protected categories. So would bullying a person based on an unpopular opinion also be considered hate speech? Is the question. You want to?
Yeah, I think the larger question is bullying hate speech? I think they're mixing or using two words in two different contexts. Certainly, bullying, discriminating, harassing someone based upon a number of statuses, including political affiliation, that can be actionable.
Yeah, I think it's not is bullying hate speech, but it's bullying speech. And I think it's not. It's like stalking or harassment. It's a form of activity, which is not speech, and which, if you can establish it according to objective criteria based on what a reasonable person would view it, it can be prohibited. But I do want to repeat that the question assumes there is a category called hate speech. You may prefer that there be this category, but in law there is no category called hate speech.
I think,
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's also important to parse that question a little bit and try to figure out what's really being asked or what's really being said, whatever the legal definitions are. And I'm sitting among all of these lawyers. And that is does that question imply that someone has felt silenced because of being in a political minority or perceiving herself to be in a political minority? And if that's true, then that's something we should worry about as an educational institution.
Okay.
So I want to kind of understand more, and I want to explore the question of the responsibilities of a private institution versus a public institution, because I agree free speech is one of the best foundations of our country, and it makes democracy possible. And it also makes things incredibly slow. And I think another great foundation of our country is that we have a separation of public sector versus private sector. Luckily, because private sector makes things faster, it makes things more productive, we generate more money, and I think the same could be said of a private institution. So, bearing that in mind, my question is, do we think our college has a responsibility to monitor and enforce different codes that a public institution or the country might? And my example is mainly the monolith of public discourse we have on campus. So we have a lot of liberal people, and technically free speech is in full effect. The 3% could get up every day and make it their mission to extol the virtues of John McCain, and it would be fine. And the issue isn't that there's a lack of free speech, at least on the surface. The issue is that people have understood that it's still not very fun to be a minority, and that's something that's true all the time. So I'm a social justice and equity rep, and in my opinion, my job on campus is completely ineffective currently because there's no one willing to disagree or be educated, because nobody's willing to say that they disagree because everyone's too afraid to. So my question is, what is the college's role in that? Because we technically have full free speech in full effect. What we don't have is a diversity of speech, and that's the choice of the students, but maybe it's also the choice of the institution to elevate some opinions in the interest of equity, maybe not liberty.
I'll take a step. Coming from my perspective, and I've talked a lot about the legal side of me, but in my work in diversity and inclusion issues, my view, and you've heard me say this, is that my view of an inclusive environment is different necessarily from just being diverse. In that, to my idea of creating an ideal educational experience is one where, yes, you can say, typically what we say with diversity, let me back up a little bit, is everybody is welcome, all right? But then once you're here, be like everyone else, don't have any different needs than anyone else, and sometimes think like everyone else. And to me, you're not getting the full benefits of having those differences here unless you're creating an environment where people can bring to life all of those things that make up their individuality. So that's one of the reasons how I reconcile, I understand what Carrie is saying about power, and I agree with that as well, but, to hear of any population that is marginalized because they're not in the mainstream and they don't feel that they can be their true actualized selves, to me, is a sign that of unhealth in the climate, in the institution. So that's how I reconcile looking at the interests of the underrepresented and the minority, because depending on the issue and depending on the day, everyone in this room falls into an underrepresented group.
Well, can I just sort of respond to this question and the previous one as well, as I'm thinking about some of these questions. One is that when we think about minority or diversity, again, we need to keep in mind the question of power differentials. So just minority in terms of numbers doesn't necessarily mean that's equivalent to less power, right? Back in South Africa, for example, I remember saying, we were having a conversation among colleagues about talking about minority having less power, and I said, well, actually, in places like South Africa and Rhodesia, the minority were the ones in power, right? So we want to make sure that we distinguish between those things. So my point is that when we talk about, for example, hate speech or the problem, I understand it's not a legal category in the U.S., but it is elsewhere. And there are scholars who have suggested thinking about hate speech and the harm it causes, not in terms of offense, but in terms of what one scholar calls group libel. That is, it's reducing the dignity and reputation of a group of people by virtue of, say, their race or religious belief or whatever. And so what we might want to think about is not only is this group a minority in terms of sheer numbers, but rather what are the historical disadvantages that accrue for a group when certain kinds of ideas or opinions are expressed against them, that maybe you say racist. So that's a different kind of question than political affiliation.
Catherine, I want to say a word about the first part of the question, the public-private part.
Right.
There certainly are private sectors where where the same rules about speech don't apply and shouldn't apply. Business, the military, and so forth. They should have different rules regarding what people can say. What I don't understand is why people think that colleges should be one of those places. It would seem to me that if there is any place that should value the widest possible toleration of speeches for the very purpose that we're here for, it is colleges. I do not understand the argument that Smith students should be less free in their expression on college campus than they would be in downtown Northampton or in Peoria, Illinois.
We have another question up there. Yes.
There's been a lot of discussion in the media about the term safe spaces. And I've been reading a lot about it, and I still am not quite sure what that means. And I'm curious as to how you define it, and whether or not an intellectual space, which also needs to be defined, can also be a safe space. And this term is especially present on Smith College campus in terms of my interactions with my friends, but also with social justice equity reps and house presidents and such. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I'm very nervous when I hear the term safe space associated with an institution of higher learning. And the reason is this. I do think that we need to have spaces that are respectful and that pay attention to differences in power and differences in access to speech. But if real learning is going on, it's not going to feel safe. It's going to feel uncomfortable. And so I think to use the term safe space implies a level of complacency almost that I think is incompatible with really deep learning.
Other questions?
I mean, can I just say that I agree? And that sometimes we, as it seems, just to complicate this, sometimes in the classroom as faculty, and in fact always in the classroom as faculty, we want to create an environment where people feel comfortable speaking out and disagreeing with each other. So I would say, let's have a safe space where you can disagree with each other and feel comfortable saying the half-formed thought, right? Because we shouldn't come in with fixed positions. We come in with fluid positions that we can change our minds by listening to each other. So if we're going to be jumped on or reprimanded by other students, for example, or certainly by the faculty member for saying something that you're thinking through, then that's not a safe space, right? So one should be able to think aloud, in other words, in the classroom. But that doesn't mean that your ideas cannot be challenged. So safe space should not mean, in an educational environment, that your ideas cannot be challenged. They should. That's the whole point of education, right?
Yes. Thank you.
And thank you so much for hosting this event. I'm a board member of the Campus Republicans, and over the course of this academic year, our members have been targeted with online harassment, both in anonymous forums and directly via the web. We've been spoken about in house living rooms and in private conversations. So much so that even just this morning, one of our co-presidents was afraid to sign on to a letter to the Sophian about campus discourse because she was afraid of the slander that would come towards her name. What do you suggest that we do about people being afraid of expressing their political beliefs, even though they're only 4%? Do you think that there are policies that we can enforce on the campus that don't restrict free speech while also protecting the opinions and validity of our students?
Mm-hmm. I'll probably take that one. Okay. So certainly you have the right to be protected against harassment. Okay. And that applies to political affiliation as well. It shouldn't happen that way. As I said, that this is a sign of a lack of health. okay? Now, I come from I've come most recently from West Michigan, where, take the numbers and invert them. Not so much the institution that I came from, but certainly the area. I mean, it was the home of Amway. A lot of funding comes out of Western Michigan. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, that should not happen. We shouldn't have an environment where anyone, regardless of their affiliation, regardless of their sexual orientation, their religion, their race, their gender identity, their gender expression, should feel inhibited from being able to express themselves. So I think that there is a role for the institution. We do have policies that prohibit harassment, and they would apply in those situations. Tying into the issue of safety, because I was thinking about, as an attorney, that makes me a little nervous because it's a squishy word. I think that you do have protections both in the law and in policies against acts of discrimination and harassment, but not necessarily protection from being offended. So, yeah, no, I agree. That shouldn't be happening.
So my question has to do with the health of diversity
Mhm.
that you mentioned, and what are some tangible ways that you think we could improve that health, and in terms of the Lagarde issue, and what are the ways that the administration can responsibly administer or not administer their authority to increase that health?
I think we have to model. We certainly have to model discourse amongst ourselves, and sometimes, and I'm not speaking, I'm new here, but I've been in higher education long enough to see that sometimes we don't model effective discourse even amongst our colleagues. We also have to have a structure where people know what their resources are in dealing with issues of harassment and discrimination. In the classroom and in other spaces where there's discussion, there should be an environment fostered where you can express unpopular opinions. I have taught. I've taught some courses. The best compliment that I received from a student as he turned in his final was to say, "Thank you for letting me express my opinions in his classroom." I didn't agree with anything that guy said the entire term. I really didn't. But I felt that it was ineffective as a learning environment to create something where he couldn't. And in situations, I'll give you an example. I talked about affirmative action in the class. I had a hard time getting students to argue against affirmative action in the class. And even though I was responsible for the affirmative action compliance of that institution, I provided those arguments. Well, what about this? What about that? Hobby Lobby, the case that went up to the Supreme Court during the term, that was actively being decided during my class, and I thought it was an interesting case, and I tried to do an analysis from different sides. I think that's part of the educational experience. I think that if you're not hearing things that challenge your opinion, that you're being shortchanged.
My question is, so in a context where people are on an equal footing or even ground, this notion of disagreeing respectfully and growing even while disagreeing with someone else it makes sense. But I think I'm probably talking about a larger context in which certain groups are marginalized, oppressed, and silenced on account of their social positions, so that the free speech of, say, I'm thinking specifically about what happened in France with the I Am Charlie post, the campaign with the hashtag activism, because these cartoons in itself perpetuated certain notions about a particular group, about their culture, about their beliefs, so that and there was this oversimplification I felt with this hashtag of what
Charlie.
for a second, but because it's problematic in that the implications of free speech is different on account of the position you occupy in society, so that sometimes protecting someone's there's a very thin line between protecting someone's free speech and actually supporting outright hatred and discrimination. So
Well, let me say a word or two about that. First, there can't be any limits on parity. That's one of the central ways we learn, that people simply have to be aware that at least in this country, which tolerates speech as widely as we do, that cartoonists and others are going to educate people by making fun of other people, and this is a point Catherine's made several times. Keep in mind that the late comedian George Carlin and the current comedian Chris Rock have said they will not speak on liberal arts college campuses anymore because people are not tolerant of that. Now, but let me add one more point about France. And this responds to one of the first points that Ambreen raised. How foolish do the French look, on the one hand, to be demonstrating in favor of free speech, and on the other hand, arresting people for denying the Holocaust? The charge of a double standard is correct as regards the French. It is not correct as regards the United States.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
So this is actually a perfect lead up to my question. My question was really, you spoke a lot about the hate speech that is a category in a lot of other countries, and I wanted to know whether you thought that was good, and the Jews of France is a perfect example. Within the last year, there have been so many conversations of whether it's safe for Jews in France, and whether that's actually protecting them in any way at all when you have people marching through the streets of France yelling, "Gas the Jews." So I think that I wonder whether those things can be applied to the United States when we have a history of so many immigrant cultures coming in, and so many, when we look back at Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Catholics, the hatred that JFK faced when he was going up for the presidency. So I wonder whether those things are actually supporting the minorities that they claim to protect.
I'm not quite sure I got the question.
Can you repeat the question? Yes.
Whether you think that the hate speech in other countries is actually protecting the minorities that they claim to protect.
Why do you think it's not? Just to state the argument so we can think about it.
I think when you look at, I'm just going to use the argument of France, for instance, and I think that, anti-Semitism as the oldest hatred in France in particular, and how it's been on the rise within the last year, and I think that, and in France there is, Holocaust denial is against the law, and so I wonder whether that is actually protecting the Jews in that case, or whether that needs to be essentially aired out. And whether that needs to be, as we talked about, the counter-argument, that pushing it back against these hatreds with just more reason and more speech and more conversations.
Counter-speech.
So whether those hate speech laws are actually protecting those minorities in the way that they are intended to.
One of the things that I found troubling about the Je suis Charlie is that a hashtag or a slogan took over when what was really needed for a lot of us, particularly outside of France, to understand is what were the social issues underneath that. What about immigration? What about a legal absolute separation between church and state, and yet immigrant groups for whom that's a foreign concept, and second and third generation immigrant groups trying to understand what it is to be French. So that hashtag or that slogan didn't really serve any positive purpose except sympathy, obviously, but it didn't serve a purpose of helping us understand better what the real issues were until later when at least in some press, you could read more carefully about what the issues really were.
I think one of the things we're hearing, it's really interesting to me that this conversation has moved from Smith out into the world in our examples. It really reinforces the sense that when we grapple with these questions, these are questions we're going to be grappling with in whatever profession or part of the world we find ourselves in. And so practicing that work here while you're at Smith is tremendously important. It's not maybe going to bring an answer that's fixed, but it may bring a local answer for you in the profession or the community that you want to commit yourself to. So this is an invitation, really, from the panel and from the Campus Discourse Working Group to keep grappling with these questions with us. We're hoping to make them the theme of a speaker series next year. And we will be, in 10 minutes, meeting upstairs in the Poetry Center for dinner for anyone who wants to keep talking together and exploring these ideas. I saw a number of hands that were up that we haven't, with questions that we haven't answered. So we'll be spending about an hour together over dinner in small group conversations, really focusing in on the most complex parts of these conversations. For those of you who've been tweeting and helping to bring the complexity to our hashtag that is so challenging to bring, we're really very, very grateful for that. But please join me now in thanking the panelists. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. We really hope you will join us for dinner.